Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's discussion. We are discussing China-Africa security aid and cooperation, and we have Patricia, who is going to be a panelist tonight. She's going to take us through different aspects that we would need to consider on China-Africa security aid and cooperation. Patricia, you can introduce yourself and start on the things that you'd like to take us through tonight.
Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to anyone who's listening to this. My name is Patricia. I'm a legal scholar, and my areas of interest are China, Africa affairs. I studied in China for my master's degree in international law, so I'm glad to be here and to share my views and my opinions on this platform, and I hope I can share something good and something can come out of it for whoever's listening. Thank you, Christine. And like Christine had introduced, the topic for today is China-Africa security aid and cooperation, the new frontier. So the gist of this topic is to introduce another aspect of China and Africa's engagement and cooperation and dynamic. As we have been discussing for some time on this platform, we've been talking about different ways in which China is engaging Africa, especially in the economic side through trade and investment, and different facets of that relationship and the outcomes of it and the implications of it and what China gains and what Africa gains. And throughout the process of developing ties with Africa, China has been experimenting on its foreign policy, and the policy that relates to security and cooperation with Africa is a very interesting and also very important dynamic in that, especially in the fact that it ties directly with China's economic interests in Africa, and to an extent how these interests affect or impact Africa's own interests and Africa's relationship with other powers, especially in the West, like the US and Europe, its traditional partners. So I think this dynamic, the security dynamic, brings in a whole new interesting perspective in understanding China and Africa's trade and investment and economic relationship to an extent. Yeah.
Okay. And I think it's quite an interesting discussion, Patricia, on this. And as you take us through, let anyone listening to know like some of the things that we'll cover. We'll go through the historical context in China and Africa peace and security cooperation. Then we'll look at drivers for China's peace and security activity in Africa. Then we'll look at characteristics and evolution of the Chinese policy on security in Africa. And then look at the legal frameworks and mechanisms in China's security activity in Africa. And this discussion is of interest and could be of interest to policymakers, to researchers, and to just for general interest, because it's a very contemporary issue, and it's very because of the amount of China's involvement in Africa right now. Like almost every country in Africa has had an influence or something that China is doing in the country. So it's quite important, like to just get a perspective of this peace and cooperation. And you can also send in questions and or even leave comments on this, and especially of things that will not be covered, which we'll cover next week. So Patricia, if you could go on and start speaking about the historical context.
Yes. Okay, thank you, Christine. So as you can see on the screen, I try to compose a small background on the China's security aid and cooperation historical relationship. So it gives you a context in which to place the contemporary issues, like Christine has pointed out. So the first point is that you have to understand that China's security diplomacy with Africa, and this is in the context of working towards achieving peace and security in Africa in the context of threats that are besides war. So you have threats that relate to civil strife, you have threats that relate to terrorism, you have threats that relate to trafficking, drug trafficking. So the context in which China's security dynamic in Africa has kind of developed over a certain period of time. And it's interesting to see the historical context because it shows you how China has matured in its policy towards Africa based on how its security diplomacy has evolved over a period of time. So when you look at the Cold War period, which was around the 1950s, that was a time when China had just come out of its own civil war against the China, the Republic of China, which was much more democratic, and the rise of the PRC, the People's Republic of China, under the China Communist Party. So at the time when China established itself as the People's Republic of China in 1949, at that time it had really strong relationships with the Soviet Union. So during that time, it did not really have a strong economic presence in Africa. Its intention to engage with Africa on a security level was only to promote its revolutionary ideas at that point. It was coming from a war that was very influenced by ideological ideas that were influenced by socialism and communism from the Soviet Union and from Marxism and Leninism and from the Mao regime that was establishing its ideology as a country because they needed an ideology, principles on which to build themselves. And these principles innately needed to have something to go against. And in Africa, at the time, we're coming out of colonialism. So at the time, most countries were really very lenient towards the West, towards their colonial masters, but also on the fence about coming in from from liberating their countries, achieving independence. So at that time, there were a lot of liberation wars, independence wars. So at that time, China did not have really deep economic interests. It was mostly supporting these governments that were trying to establish states. And you have to understand that from the perspective of China's idea that the state is central to a government. You have to have a strong state-centric mentality that power comes from the state, from the government. It does not come from democracy. So it was trying to push that ideology with most of the leaders that were coming out at that time. So if you look at the most of the leaders or most of the groups China was backing at that time, they all had very strong socialist or communist ideas. So it was supporting these liberation wars, these civil, guerrilla warfare at that time. So during that Cold War period between 1950s and the 1970s, this ideology was very strong, and it was one of the principal reasons that established the China-Africa, relationship. So it gave China an upper hand in that way because most of the governments we have now in Africa were established at that time. The dictators we have were established at that time. So what we see, the economic policies that they're taking in or the way they run the government, it's mostly to hold on to power, to stay into power, to centralize power within one person or one government, which is an ideology that China supports. So what we can say is that the governments that are in now, the regimes that are in now in most countries, especially the ones that were supported by China, they have a great leniency towards China and towards supporting the cooperation efforts that are going on with China right now. So this history is very interesting because it sets up what we're seeing, the relationship we're seeing with African, countries now in trade, in cooperation, and also the way governments are working now. They are state-centered. You have a lot of dictators or regimes that last for such a very long time. And even if they do, to a certain extent, say that they are democratic, which is ideas that they got from the West when they were setting up their governments, that they have, separation powers, they have courts, they have, they agree that they have human rights principles. These are like African countries have learned to balance relationships they have with powers that are greater than themselves. So they will say that yes, we agree, we agree with the democratic principles, but the history they had with China through supporting their regimes in the past helped them to set themselves up in power. And this is an important dynamic that needs to be understood and to give you a picture of how the mentality and the kind of like the understanding that China has with these long regimes that African countries have now. So I think that is an interesting background. It gives you an image of how important history is to this dynamic in China and African relations through the security, the security perspective, because Chinese security was very important in setting up some of these regimes. So these regimes are now very sympathetic to Chinese trade and economic partnerships now. So it is quite interesting in that perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, Patricia, that's very interesting, and especially looking at even one of the things that you mentioned on your presentation about like China's, like policies about like non-interference with internal affairs, and
Yes.
like mutual respect for state sovereignty and
Yeah.
territorial integrity. It's things
Yeah.
that up to today is almost like part of the soft power that China uses because they
Yes.
tell you that we will not interfere with your politics. We will not interfere,
Yeah.
like at least not outwardly. So
Yeah.
that what China will never like like tell you, for instance, you need to change these structures within your governance for us, for instance, to cooperate with you, or you need, unlike the West. And so China,
Yes.
at least on the face of it, you never see that kind of interference from China. So
You,
it's quite interesting, and especially when you share these the background to like the ideologies they have. On one hand, it sounds like the ideologies don't call for that kind of, like non-interference because as you've noted, the regimes
yes.
are now quite sympathetic to China, yet they are
Yeah.
not interfering per se, like on the it's
Yeah.
quite the outcome of soft power, I guess. They are reaping
Yeah,
the
it's the
fruit of.
outcome of soft power because if you see the relationship the Chinese government set up with African countries, especially during the 1955 Bandung conference in Indonesia. This conference was very important because it set up that principle of the New World Order, the New World Order, which has more involvement for developing countries and the idea of South cooperation. So to take out that idea of being dependent on the North, on the powers that had already set up a world order that was not sympathetic to developing countries and all the demands that entailed going along with some of these economic policies that were set up by the North that did not have in mind the needs of developing countries. So at this conference and with these principles of non-interference in internal affairs, solidarity and peaceful coexistence, you'll see this language a lot in the foreign policy that China advances towards African countries, and African leaders are very welcoming to this kind of language because there's a lot that goes in in its own internal workings that it does not want to meddle in, and there are all these kinds of demands and conditions that come with cooperating with the North, asking for development aid from the North. For China, it promises no strings attached aid. We are in this together. There will be mutual benefit, there will be sovereignty, there will be no interference with your territorial integrity. We will not send in troops to force your hand to do this. We'll only ask for your permission to do whatever we're going to do. We'll always support you as a fellow developing country. So this conference and these principles are quite very important. But also later on, I think when we discuss the implications of these principles to the relationship between China and Africa, I feel like it has become these principles are too generalized, No one really understands what they mean because they leave room for interpretation and for flexibility, and they are too reliant and they are too lazy, I feel like. If you're going to say we're going to rely on non-interference in your internal affairs, but indirectly you force the hand of African states when you give them a certain amount of money to favor certain, development policies over others, especially when those development policies lead to you relaxing certain, legal or certain regulations, or having concessions on certain things, or turning a blind eye to the evils that some of these regimes have wrought on their own people. So it leaves too much leeway. It has done certain damage to African states
I
by
agree.
being too reliant on these principles that are too vague, they're too generalized, they are up there in space with no rules. Yeah.
And I agree. And this is especially because uh, keeping funding, turning a blind eye in some
Yes.
cases, at least it's not that I think the West helps in any case by telling you to be democratic, because the
Yeah.
solutions the West gives don't solve the problems. But
Mhm.
in Africa, and you can listen to other discussions that we've had, especially a discussion that we had some time back on conditionalities on foreign aid, and we were looking at like
Yes.
whether the West telling Africa to set up democratic elections and such things, as important as they are, the problems that Africa faces
Yes.
sometimes is even basic economic rights are not there. Like right to even
Mm.
health, right to housing. So you
Yeah.
might be saying the solution that the West is giving for quicker development in Africa is we should have democracy. Fair enough, democracy is working, or is good for the countries and for the governance. But the real issues that Africa faces most times are very lack of economic rights for the people, like poverty levels, healthcare, such things are a problem. So when China also, on the other hand, turns a blind eyes and keeps funding, especially governments that are making it worse for the citizens,
Yeah.
that doesn't help either. But i
Yeah.
think i think China, that works for them, because if you're not question some of these systems, then China can just keep giving the money and being able to, for instance, get resources and such kinds of things. And the only thing they'll say is that, for us guys, it's just business. Like, we don't care
Yeah,
if
it's just
like
we
there's
don't interfere
ongoing
with,
war.
with your internal affairs. We let you deal with your own problems. But
Yeah.
the problems that come about are to the advantage of China, not to the advantage of African countries. Those conflicts, they gain from them. They are the gain they have. There's a result. When they go to some of these countries and offer to, like, I'll give the example of Congo. You offer money, all this kind of money to go and have these mines, but then there are rebels, there's civil strife over this same project, this same money you're trying to get from this country. You damage. Your money is funding some of these things, these atrocities that are coming about, but you will always hide behind the principle of non-interference. So it kind of doesn't make sense. It forces you to look at what your responsibility. If you are stepping up as a partner, then you have to also look at your own responsibility from your
Yeah.
end.
Yeah.
Yes.
And we actually had this discussion on our podcast last week, where we are looking at, if Africa is so resource rich, then why is it that there are such poverty levels? And one of the places we are looking at is DR Congo, where
Yeah.
we were looking at, like, the minerals that are coming from Congo, from DR Congo, are very valuable for the global supply chain. Yet in Congo, like, in DR Congo, sorry, the situation of living, the poverty, the fights are so, like, it's on the other extreme. Like, you think that there's nothing that supplies to the global value chain that comes from there. And then we were noting that these wars and such a collapsed society helps the people who are gain helps people to gain. It helps the people who are mining to gain. It helps China to be, and the biggest exporters. DR Congo is one of the biggest exporters to China, as per the
Yeah.
China Africa Research Institute findings in 2019. So
Yeah.
so this non-interference, I think it's a veil, something to hide behind, if you
Yes.
ask me. But
Yeah, it's
yeah.
something to hide behind. All the principles that you look at a certain point, if you interpret them in the other way, then they take on a different kind of meaning. If you're saying we're not going to, there's non-interference in your internal affairs, but you interfere by pushing the hand of some of the civil strife that is going on, that is direct interference.
Mm.
If you're involved in, you're saying we are going to have solidarity and peaceful coexistence, you're not standing by the atrocities, the people themselves who are fighting. That is not solidarity. You're standing by the government, which is a handful of people. You can only count but the real Africans suffer. If you're saying mutual respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, then you're not looking at what cost some of what you're doing is putting on the sovereignty of these people. Or if you're looking at mutual benefit, like, how do the Africans benefit all this? Yes, the people in power will benefit, but they're still some of the poorest people on the planet. They suffer, they have their human rights they are raped because of these mining these things. They literally get no, medical supplies, they get no proper education. Where is the benefit of the development you're parading to this under this policy? So if you look at it in that way, in the other way, if you analyze it in that way, then you see that it doesn't benefit anyone but China and a few African leaders. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's such an obvious observation when you put it that way.
Yes.
Yeah. Mm.
Yeah, so I feel like as if African policymakers and Africans in general, African researchers should view some of these policies, these ideologies, these principles on the surface. They might look beneficial. And I feel like also for the Chinese government itself, they might not understand the true harm of what they're doing, and they might be experimenting with their own policies because they do not want to step on any toes. So they might not consider infinitely, like deep down, what the kind of aid they're giving or the kind of cooperation, what implications it has on the people themselves and not on the state. It's the country. A country is not the state, it's not the government, it is the people. So I feel like policymakers should look at some of the foundations, the values on which relationships are built, and then analyze that and make a critical evaluation of those values and those principles, and then establish where you're going to go from there. You see what effect your shared values are, and then you make an assessment of that, and then you change your policy according to the situation, the realistic situation on the ground. So I feel like that does put into perspective some of these dynamics.
But Patricia, I would like also to highlight the last discussion we had with you,
Yeah.
especially on like where we were noting that the China or the West, there's no one who exists to train Africa how to
Yeah.
how to become better. Everyone is looking out for their own interest. There's no one. China is looking out for their interest, and some of these policies they're experimenting with them, but because they are not living with the reality of the outcome of these policies in Angola, in Kenya,
Yeah.
in DR Congo, it's not Chinese people who are experiencing the outcome of these try and error policies they have. It's people in
Yeah.
those countries who are. And so China, I mean, as much as they are responsible, and especially when you put it into perspective that they're interfering by giving funds to people who are using these funds to
Yeah.
oppress and to perpetuate human rights abuses in these countries, and that's interference because you're enabling them financially.
Yes.
But the people who are actually feeling the outcome of this effect are the people in these countries. And so as much as China and policymakers could look at that on what changes could be done on China's policies, the people on the ground who are experiencing this should be the ones feeling the pinch and reacting to it and coming up with counter policies or ways to streamline what China is experimenting in their countries. So, and that's the thing, no one exists to help Africa figure out its problems. Africa needs to, these countries need to realize what interference is happening and put up measures to counter such things. And
Yes.
that's what we were saying in our last discussion, especially about financial aid. Africa themselves, they need to come up with their own strategies on how to deal with
Exactly.
issues.
Exactly.
Yeah.